Okay, so now that we have a sense of who Shakespeare is, right, and what his body of work is, and how we got the play Macbeth in that 1623 first folio, let's take a look at Shakespeare's English, because many times my students say to me, Edward, how are we supposed to understand Shakespeare's English? It's so different from English today. Well, the answer to that question is that Shakespeare's English is not as different as sometimes we think. And with some practice and with some knowledge, we can learn to overcome the obstacles in Shakespeare's English so that anyone out there watching this course and willing to work hard will be able to understand the plot characters of Macbeth and even perform some important analysis of key speeches. So let's take a look. One reason why Shakespeare's English can seem a little bit different from ours is because when he wrote, grammar, vocabulary, and spelling were not as standardized as they are today. And one anecdote or small story I like to bring up is that the first English dictionary was printed in 1604. Macbeth was performed in 1606. So that means that when Macbeth was performed for the first time, there had only been an English dictionary for 2 years. So that's an indication that there weren't as many rules about grammar, about vocabulary, about spelling. So this lack of rules and these inconsistencies can make things a little bit difficult for the modern reader. However, it's also important that we recognize that Shakespeare's English is modern English. Sometimes people say that Shakespeare's English is Old English. This is totally not true. If you were to read Beowulf, for example, the most famous Old English text extant today that people study in school and scholars analyze at universities, you would not be able to understand Beowulf. It's like a foreign language. Even if you were to read a Middle English text, probably the most popular being the Canterbury Tales, right, by Chaucer, if you are really good at reading English literature and you're very careful and you sound out the language, maybe you would be able to understand the basic plot and meaning of the words. But it's still going to be very, very different from modern English. Shakespeare's English, however, with the help of a glossary, is understandable and intelligible to readers today, including you at home. Okay? But in order to make sure we understand it, we need to know a couple of pieces of information about how it's going to be different and how we can decode little differences between Shakespeare's English and our own. So the first thing that we want to make sure we understand about Shakespeare's English is that pronouns are significantly different. Okay? Now, Shakespeare's English, early modern English, like most languages today, including German, Spanish, and even Chinese, had different kinds of second-person pronouns, right? In Chinese, for example, if we want to show respect, we would say nin. And if we want to speak in a more familiar, friendly way with someone we know, we would say ni, right? So there are two different second-person pronouns. That's the same as Spanish, right, with tu and usted. It's the same as German and multiple other languages. English today doesn't have that difference. You call everyone you. But in Shakespeare's day, there was a difference. There were two forms of second-person pronouns. There was thou, and there was you. Okay? So the second person, we have thou is the subject form. Thee is the object form. Thy is the possessive form. Thine is another possessive form. Thyself is the reflexive form. And ye would be the plural form. A quick note about ye is that it's very rarely used. I think it's only used once in Macbeth when Macbeth gives instructions to the murderers in Act 3. And in Shakespeare's day, this would have been an old-fashioned form. But whenever you see thou or thee, you need to think in your head that it means you. Whenever you see thy, think your. Thine, think your or yours. Thyself, think yourself. And occasionally, if you see ye in Shakespeare, you want to be thinking about you, the plural form. And when you're analyzing the text, you can think about whether we're using the more familiar forms of the pronouns or the more formal forms of the pronouns, right? What do you think it means when a character uses a formal form of the pronoun? Well, it probably means that the person being addressed is of a higher status or is important. What do you think it means when someone is using thou or thee to address somebody? It probably means that they're of a lower status or they're a close friend or family member. Okay, so don't get confused by these pronouns. With a little bit of practice and by learning this chart, it'll be no problem for you when you're reading Macbeth. In addition to pronouns, another minor difference between the language is verbs. And really, guys, this is simple. Oftentimes, verbs that would end with an S, right, like the third person singular form, often ends with an S. In Shakespeare's English, it's going to end with a TH, right? Some examples of some common verbs that have this ending shift. What we would call has, Shakespeare writes as hath. Notice this TH. Does is doth. Says is saith, right? So oftentimes this S that ends is turned into a TH in Shakespeare's English. But this is nothing for you to worry about. After a little bit of practice and knowing to look out for it, you're not even going to notice it anymore, and it's going to become really easy to understand what these verbs mean. Two other differences between Shakespeare's verbs and our own have to do with the simple past form and the participial form. So, in our English today, sometimes we'll see an irregular participle like broken, right? Or we'll see an irregular simple past form like broke. In Shakespeare's English, this irregular participle or irregular simple past is still irregular, but it's a little bit of a different form. So in Shakespeare, for example, you wouldn't say broken or broke. You would say break. Right? So notice, very similar. We have the same consonants, B, R, K, just our vowels are a little bit different. We have an A here instead of an O. Not a big difference. Another example is that some of our English forms that are regular, right, like helped is the participle form of to help, right? I have helped some people today. Have helped. For Shakespeare, sometimes that regular participle becomes a weird irregular participle like holp, H-O-L-P, right? But again, this is nothing for us to worry about. Notice H, vowel, L, P, H, vowel, L, P. So the consonants are almost always the same, just the vowels are changing a little bit. And in the endings of our verbs, oftentimes, whereas we would have an S, Shakespeare has a TH. So pronouns and vowels, as long as you keep this information in mind, you should be okay reading Macbeth. I encourage you to study these charts and pay attention as you're reading Act 1. With a little bit of practice, it'll be easy for you to overcome these small differences between Shakespeare's English and our own. Now, where Shakespeare's vocabulary gets difficult is perhaps more of a chief challenge for us. Okay, so Shakespearean vocabulary is what students first notice as really making the language seem foreign. Okay? But it's important for us to know that there are really two reasons why Shakespeare's vocabulary is challenging. Reason number one is because Shakespeare knew about a lot of different topics, and he incorporated all of these topics into his plays. And an example of a topic that he tends to write about is falconry. So a falcon is a type of predatory bird, right? Here's a falcon. And falconry is the practice of keeping and training falcons, usually for the purpose of hunting. Now, today, some people still practice falconry. Some cultures may have falconry as an important traditional component. But probably you've never practiced falconry, and I know I've never practiced falconry. So we don't know the vocabulary associated with falconry. Okay? Let me give you an example. So here's a quote from Macbeth where we see falconry alluded to. Come sealing night, scarf up the tender eye of pitiful day. Okay, so what Shakespeare's talking about here basically is, he's kind of imagining a nighttime scene. Right? This nighttime scene. And he wants the nighttime scene to cover up the sun, right? So this is the sun. And Macbeth is about to do something very terrible, and he wants no one else to be able to see it, so he's asking the nighttime to fall and to cover up the sun. So he says, "Come, sealing night, scarf up the tender eye of pitiful day." Right? So eye here is referring to the sun, right? The eye of day is the sun. Okay? But part of what makes this metaphor even more confusing is that Shakespeare is adding vocabulary related to falconry. Now, what does sealing mean? Sealing is a verb that means to cover a falcon's eyes with a mask, right? This falcon's eyes have been covered by a hood or by a mask. It means the falcon's eyes have been sealed, S-E-E-L. Another term for this that comes from falconry is scarf up. To scarf up means to cover the eyes of a falcon in Shakespeare's day. So when we read this, the metaphor itself is not that difficult. I mean, to ask the night to cover the eye of day, we can make the connection that Macbeth is asking for nighttime to fall with darkness on the sunshine of the day. But when we add in this vocabulary related to falconry, it can be kind of confusing. What? What does a scarf have to do with what we're talking about? Sealing? What? What does sealing have to do with anything? Right? So when you see vocabulary like this, there's a good chance that it's not that the vocab is difficult, but rather that it relates to a strange topic such as falconry. And when you see this, you want to always be checking your glossary. Most editions of Shakespeare's Macbeth, including the Signet Classic version that I recommend to you, they're going to have footnotes at the bottom of the page, and they'll explain the meanings of any of these weird words. Okay, so don't be intimidated. A second reason why Shakespeare's English vocabulary can be a little bit challenging is because some words seem familiar but have totally different meanings. Okay, so let's look at an example from Macbeth. There's a stage direction in Act 4. We're going to look at this later in the course. It's very, very important. A show of 8 kings in Banquo, last king with a glass in his hand. All the words here seem okay, right? This seems like modern English. But there's one word that we know, glass, that means something totally different. In Shakespeare's time, a glass was a mirror. So if you read this word glass and think about the common present-day meaning, you might be a little bit confused. You need to be aware that glass for Shakespeare means mirror. But again, the edition of the book has a glossary and footnotes that are going to help you understand the vocabulary. So if there's one tip I can give you about Shakespearean vocabulary, the tip is footnotes. When you read the play, check the footnotes. They're always going to explain any differences in vocabulary. The final, and in my opinion, most challenging aspect of Shakespeare's English is not the vocabulary, not the pronouns, not the verbs, but rather the word order or the syntax. Shakespearean syntax often occurs in a different order than present-day syntax, right? We know the character Yoda, maybe, from the Star Wars franchise, and Yoda is memorable because he kind of speaks in a Shakespeare way, right? Yoda says, "Much to learn you still have." Now, if we were going to say, "Much to learn you still have," we would say it differently. We would probably say, "You still have much to learn." But Yoda is memorable because he switches the order of chunks in his sentences, right? And we see something like this happening in Shakespeare as well, right? Let's take a look at an example. Right here we have a line from The Witches where they're speaking, or sorry, from Lady Macbeth, where she's speaking to Macbeth in Act 1, Scene 5. "Glamis thou art, and Cawdor, and shalt be what thou art promised." So to a new student, this sentence can seem very, very, very confusing. But we can unpack it and we realize the reason why it's confusing is because of the word order. Let's take a look. all this really says is you are thane of Glamis and Cawdor and shall be what you are promised. So quickly, you would need to know that a thane of Glamis, right, is a title of nobility. Right? Maybe you've heard, for example, of the Duke of York. Right? The Duke of York, Duke is the title of nobility. It's a type of nobleman, and York is a place. Okay? Similarly, thane of Glamis, thane is a Scottish title of nobility. Macbeth takes place in Scotland, and Glamis is a place in Scotland, right? So once we understand that, we need to realize that the original Shakespeare has the subject is thou, which means you. The verb is art, which means are, A-R-E. And the object is Glamis, which means the same thing as thane of Glamis. In our present-day English, we would put the subject first, then the verb are, and then the object, thane of Glamis. You are thane of Glamis. Here we have Glamis, you are. Glamis, thou art. Right? So the order of the words is what makes Shakespeare a little bit challenging here. But I need you to trust me here that this is what makes reading Shakespeare difficult at first. But with a little bit of practice, I promise that you can understand Shakespeare's Macbeth. Just stick with it and work hard. And remember that if you have trouble with this, it's not just you if your first language is Chinese. I went to school in America, and I remember many of my high school classmates who were native English speakers and very smart. We read Macbeth when we were in grade 11 in high school. And many of my classmates struggled, and they thought, what does this mean? I don't understand Shakespeare's English. But with practice, by reading the glossary, knowing the differences between the pronouns and verbs and vocabulary and sentence structure, anybody who is willing to work hard and put an effort can understand Shakespeare's English. And I invite you to try with me throughout this course.